All right, let's just jump right in. When you hear the word feminism, it's easy to picture it as this one, single, unified thing. But the reality, whoa, it's way more explosive than that. You see, feminism isn't some fixed doctrine. It's a battlefield of ideas, a collection of really profound and often clashing arguments about our most fundamental questions. So, I've got to ask you, what is feminism? It sounds like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? Well, it's not. The greatest thinkers who've shaped this movement would give you completely, I mean radically, different answers. In fact, they've been fiercely debating it for decades. And that right there is the key to this whole explainer. Feminism isn't one clean ideology. It's a living, breathing, and often messy argument. The really juicy, important debates, they're not happening with people outside feminism. Nope, they're happening right at its very heart. So let's jump in and unpack three of the biggest internal clashes. Okay, first up, the battle over the main character of this story. Who or what exactly is the woman that feminism is supposed to be for? Because depending on how you answer that, well, it changes the entire game. The brilliant poet Audre Lorde just nails this with her concept of the mythical norm. You know what she's talking about. In America, she says, this default person we all have in our heads is white, thin, young, heterosexual, and financially secure. The big problem for early feminism was that it kind of built its whole idea of woman around that default, leaving out a ton of people who looked at that image and just knew, deep down, that is not me. And this is where things really start to split. On one side, you had this powerful idea of a universal sisterhood, the belief that all women are basically in the same boat, united by a common struggle. But then thinkers like Bell Hooks came along and said, hold on a second. She argued that you just can't talk about gender without talking about race, class, and sexuality too. I mean, the lived experience of a wealthy white woman is a totally different world from that of a poor black woman, because their struggles intersect in completely different ways. And Hooks did not mince words. She said, the feminism of her day had this party line, and it was dominated by privileged white women, and this wasn't some accident or oversight. No, it was an active practice that shut people out, that silenced women whose own lives didn't fit the accepted story. It basically choked off any new and different ideas before they could even get started. And then the philosopher Judith Butler takes this whole thing to a whole nother level. She asks this really radical question. What if the problem is the category of women itself? Think about it. The second you try to define women as this stable, neat little group, don't you automatically start creating new rules about who counts as a real woman and who doesn't? This wasn't just about who gets included anymore. This rocked the very foundation of identity politics. Which leads us perfectly into our second huge clash. And this one gets right down to what it even means to have a body. Is our gender baked into our biology, into our sex, or is it something we create, something we perform? So in one corner, you have the powerhouse critic Camille Paglia. For her, sex is not some polite social construct. Oh no, it is primal, biological, a demonic force of nature. She basically argues that feminism tried to clean it up, to explain it away with neat social theories, when in reality it's this turbulent, chaotic, and uncontrollable power that nature just imposes on us. And in the complete opposite corner, you've got Judith Butler again, with her famous theory of performativity. Butler's take is that gender isn't some deep, authentic thing you are. It's something you do. It's a performance. It's all the little repeated acts, gestures, and ways you style your body. It's a ritual we all do that creates the illusion of a natural, fixed gender. You're not born a gender. You become one by performing the part. I mean, you really can't get much further apart than that, right? For Paglia, the body is nature. It's raw biological reality that culture can't tame. But for Butler, the body is like a blank page, a text. It has no real meaning until culture comes along and writes gender all over it. So you've got unchangeable reality on one side and radical construction on the other. Wow. Okay, let's get to our third and final battleground. And this one is huge. It's about the end game. What is the ultimate goal here? Should feminism be about getting women an equal slice of the existing pie, or should it be about throwing that pie out and baking a completely new one? In other words, is the goal equality or revolution? The philosopher Christina Hoff Sommers labels one approach equity feminism. This is the classic tradition, and it's probably what a lot of people think of. The goal is straightforward: work within the current system to get legal and social equality. It wants for women what it wants for everyone: Just a fair shot, no discrimination. The whole fight is for equal access and equal opportunity. But Sommers draws a sharp line between that and what she calls gender feminism. From this perspective, the system is the problem. It's not just a little flawed, it's a patriarchy, a whole structure designed to keep men in charge. So the goal here isn't just reform, it's a radical transformation, a teardown and rebuild of every single institution, from the family all the way up to the state. And Bell Hooks gives us one of the most powerful definitions of this revolutionary goal. For her, feminism is simply a movement to end sexist oppression. Notice what that definition does. It deliberately shifts the focus away from just being equal to men. Instead, it points us toward the entire systems of domination and how sex, race, and class are all tangled up together. Yeah, the goal isn't just to get a seat at the table, it's to dismantle the table itself. So after seeing these deep, massive conflicts that seem like they could never be solved, you might be sitting there thinking, wow, is feminism just tearing itself apart? But here's the fascinating twist. What if these arguments, these fractures, aren't a weakness at all? So let's just do a super quick recap of the 3 core clashes we looked at. First, the battle over the subject. Is it a universal woman or an intersectional identity? Second, the battle over the source. Is gender biology or performance? And third, the battle over the goal. Is it reform for equality or a total revolution? And here is the big takeaway, the thing I really want you to think about. These contradictions, these fierce internal fights, they're not failures. They are the engine of feminist thought. They're what forces the movement to evolve, to question itself, and to become smarter and more powerful. In a way, the argument is the movement. Which leaves us with one final big question to chew on. In a world that wants simple answers and unified groups, are all these fractures a fatal flaw that will forever hold the movement back? Or could they actually be feminism's greatest intellectual strength, the very thing that guarantees it never becomes a rigid, unthinking dogma? The debate, you can be sure, continues. So, what is feminism? I mean, it sounds like a simple question, right? But the second you start digging, you find out it's not one single idea. Nope. It's a huge, brilliant, and honestly often contradictory conversation that's been going on for decades. Today, we're not going to try and find one right answer. Instead, we're going to jump right into the biggest debates inside feminist theory, and we'll do it by looking at 6 really important books that completely shape the discussion. And we're going to kick things off with a statement that gets right to the heart of it all. Yeah, you heard that right. We're starting here with this incredibly provocative statement. Strictly speaking, women cannot be said to exist. Now, if that makes you kind of stop in your tracks and go, wait, what? That's exactly the point. It just pulls the rug out from under what so many people assume feminism is all about, and it perfectly sets the stage for how deep and how intense these questions really get. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle that massive question. Who or what is woman? Then, we'll get into who feminism is actually for, by moving from what's called the margin to the center. After that, get ready, because we're diving into the explosive debate over nature versus nurture. Then, we'll look at some of the sharpest critiques that came from inside feminism itself. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by looking at the movement's unfinished business. So let's get right into it with that foundational question. I mean, you can't even begin to talk about women's rights or women's liberation if you haven't first asked, what does the category woman even mean? Is it just a simple biological fact? Is it a social role we play? Or is it something else entirely? For a long, long time, the starting point for this whole conversation was Simone de Beauvoir's landmark book, The Second Sex. Her big idea, the one that changed everything, was this: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Now, that was a revolutionary thing to say back then. She was arguing that being a woman wasn't some biological destiny. Instead, society had always defined woman as, well, the second sex, the other. Her whole identity was built in relation to man, who got to be the default, the normal human being. So, de Beauvoir kicked the door wide open. But then, decades later, another philosopher, Judith Butler, walked right through that door and started questioning, well, everything. If you become a woman, what if that whole process isn't about becoming something that's already there? What if the identity itself is just a kind of illusion? And that leads us to Judith Butler's absolutely game-changing idea of gender performativity. Butler basically says there's no real core gender identity hiding inside you. Instead, gender is something you do. It's not something you are. Think of it like this. We're all sort of handed a script at birth. And by repeating certain actions, ways of talking, ways of dressing, all these performative acts, we create this social fiction that man and woman are natural, solid things. It's a total rethinking of the entire concept from the ground up. Okay, so let's say we can figure out what woman means. That still leaves another massive question on the table. Is the experience of being a woman the same for everybody? Because that idea of a universal sisterhood came under some serious fire for completely ignoring the huge divides of race and class. And that's where this debate goes next. And this is where the brilliant cultural critic Bell Hooks comes in with a really powerful critique. She basically argued that for way too long, what everyone was calling feminist theory was actually just the theory of one specific group, white, educated, middle-class women who were living, as she put it, at the center of society. But in her book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, Hooks doesn't just point out the problem. She offers a radical solution. She said, if you want to build a movement that can actually change things, you have to start with the experiences of the people who are most oppressed. You have to build your theory from the margins inward, not the other way around. And the amazing writer Audre Lorde takes this idea even further. She gave us the words to understand that these systems, racism, sexism, homophobia, they aren't separate problems you can tackle one at a time. No, she saw them as interlocking. For a Black lesbian woman, for instance, sexism, racism, and homophobia aren't separate struggles. They are one single tangled experience of oppression. And that brings us right into one of the biggest, most knockdown, drag-out fights in all of feminist thought, the battle over biology. Is our gendered reality all about how we're raised, about social conditioning? Or does nature, our hormones, our bodies, play a powerful, undeniable role? And here you've got two titans in a total head-on collision. On one side, you have that social constructionist view from Judith Butler, that gender is a performance with no real biological starting point. But on the other side, you have the absolute firebrand Camille Paglia, who fires back that no way, sexuality is this incredibly powerful dance between nature and culture, and if you ignore nature, you're making a huge mistake. And Paglia, well, she does not mince words. She argues that a huge chunk of academic feminism has become, as she puts it, scientifically illiterate by trying to pretend biology doesn't matter. For Paglia, feminism cut itself off from the deep, mythic, sometimes even dangerous power of sex that's rooted in nature, which she calls the cosmic sexual power of women. And by doing that, she says it completely lost its connection to reality. So all of this internal frustration leads us to our next major debate, the idea that feminism was, in a sense, hijacked. A number of really prominent feminist thinkers started arguing that the movement had betrayed its original goals and turned into an ideology that was more about grievance than about real equality. So to understand this critique, we have to look at a distinction made by the philosopher Christina Hoff Sommers. In her book, Who Stole Feminism, she comes up with this term gender feminism, and she argues this is a specific faction that completely moved away from the original goal of equity and fairness. Instead, it adopted this worldview that sees all of society as one rigid patriarchy that's just designed to oppress women. According to Sommers, this ideology is built on a few core beliefs. First, that we live under a male hegemony. Second, that society is just one constant gender war. And third, that a main goal of the movement should be to spread stories of female victimhood. In this view, she argues, every single institution, from the family to the government, is just seen as another tool of male dominance, which she believes is a total distortion of reality. And, this wasn't just Sommers saying this. You hear an even more, let's say, blunt version of this critique from Camille Paglia. She famously called academic women's studies programs institutionalized sexism and a morass of unchallenged groupthink. So for both Paglia and Sommers, a really powerful part of feminism had basically shut down all dissent and lost its intellectual edge, replacing it with a rigid, punishing ideology. So, where does all this leave us? We've seen feminism basically fracture over its most fundamental questions. And that really brings us to our conclusion. What is feminism's unfinished business? Well, the truth is, it's about continuing to wrestle with these exact same questions, which are just as vital and just as unresolved today as they've ever been. First up, we're still grappling with that foundational challenge from de Beauvoir and Butler. Is a woman a real, stable identity that you can organize a political movement around, or is it a fluid, unstable performance that maybe we should try to move beyond altogether? The answer to that changes the entire project. And that challenge from bell hooks and Audre Lorde, it is still a central, unresolved tension. Can one single movement really speak for the interests of all women? Or will the deep divisions of race and class and sexuality always fracture that dream of a truly universal sisterhood? And of course, that great battle between nature and nurture is still raging. Is our gendered experience really dictated by biology, something Paglia says we have to acknowledge? Or is it all just a social script that we have the power to rewrite, like Butler suggests? Or is the real truth somewhere in that incredibly intricate, messy middle? And I think that brings us to the most important takeaway. Maybe the greatest strength of feminist thought isn't that it gives us a single, neat answer. Maybe its real power is that it's dynamic, evolving, and absolutely essential argument. It's a lens that lets us relentlessly question power and identity and the very structure of our world. And that is a conversation that is definitely far from over.
If you locked the 6 most famous feminist thinkers of the last century in a room together, I mean, they wouldn't just argue over how to save women.
No, not at all.
They would probably end up arguing over whether the word woman even means anything at all in the first place.
Right, and they wouldn't be polite about it either. I mean,
Right.
The intellectual hostility between some of the texts we're looking at today is just staggering.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. For you, the listener, trying to navigate feminist theory can feel, well, completely overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. It's a whole lot.
You hear the slogans, you see these caricatures in the media, and there's this prevailing assumption that feminism is just this monolith, like it's a single unified blueprint for social justice.
Which is such a misconception.
Exactly. So our mission today is to completely shatter that illusion for you.
Yeah, we are taking 6 monumental tests. We got Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, Bell Hook's Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
That's a heavy one.
Ugh, very heavy. And then Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, Christina Hoff Sommers, who stole feminism, and Camille Paglia's Free Women, Free Men.
That is quite the lineup.
It is. And working exclusively from the pages of these sources, we are going to treat them as competing, overlapping, and honestly, often fiercely contradictory lenses.
Lenses on what it actually means to be a woman, the real sources of oppression, and the very nature of power.
Right.
Think of this deep dive like examining a highly complex diamond. If you hold it up to the light of bell hooks, the flaws of capitalism and racism become glaringly obvious.
But then if you turn it...
Yeah, if you turn it and look through the lens of someone like Camille Paglia, the entire biological and historical structure of the stone just shifts entirely.
It's a completely different view.
It really is. And I want to be clear, we are not here to declare a winner today.
No, wait a minute.
We're not picking a side. We are here to map the intellectual battlefield for you, to dig into these profound contradictions and explain exactly how these thinkers arrived at such radically different conclusions.
And to map that battlefield effectively, I think we need to quickly frame the 6 lenses we're working with.
Good idea.
Because these texts, they don't just exist in a vacuum. They sit on a timeline of intense reaction. They aren't just reacting to historical patriarchy, they're reacting vehemently to each other.
So let's establish the cast of characters here. We start with Simone de Beauvoir and The Second Sex. This was published in 1949, right?
Yeah, 1949.
This is basically the existential bedrock of modern feminism. Her core argument is that throughout history, man has established himself as the default human, like the absolute.
Right, the standard.
Exactly.
Yep.
While woman has been defined purely in opposition to him, she is the other.
Capital O, other. And then moving forward to the 1980s, we have bell hooks. Her book acts as this massive intersectional corrective to the movement.
Because she was looking at mainstream feminism at the time.
Yeah, she looks at it and argues it was essentially hijacked by white, bourgeois, college-educated women. So Hooks demands a shift in focus from that privileged center out to the marginalized. She insists that true feminism has to be a mass-based political movement tackling capitalism and racism right alongside sexism.
Okay, so that's a huge shift. But then the intellectual ground just completely opens up in 1990 with Judith Butler's Gender Trouble.
Oh, it's an earthquake.
A post-structuralist earthquake. And I'm definitely going to need you to define post-structuralist for me later.
I will, I promise.
Because Butler questions the very linguistic and natural foundations of sex and gender. She argues that gender isn't something you internally are, it's something you actively do.
Right, it's a verb. And alongside that deconstruction, we have the voice of the poet-activist Audre Lorde, through her essay collection, Sister Outsider.
And she brings a totally different energy, right?
She really does. Lorde highlights the sheer power of difference, specifically race, class, and sexuality. And she issues this profound warning about the danger of trying to dismantle oppressive systems using the exact same conceptual tools that built those systems in the first place.
The master's tools concept, we will definitely get into that. But wait, because the pendulum swings hard in the opposite direction.
Oh, it swings so hard.
Enter Christina Hoff Sommers in 1994 with Who Stole Feminism. Sommers is, well, she's the classical liberal, the equity advocate.
She pushes back fiercely against what she calls gender feminism.
Which is the academic theory that women are trapped in this patriarchal gender war. And Sommers argues instead for a return to pure Enlightenment-style equality.
Which brings us to Camille Paglia and her collection, Free Women, Free Men.
The provocateur.
The libertarian provocateur, exactly. She launches this blistering critique against what she sees as the coddling, unscholarly groupthink of modern academic women's studies.
She does not hold back.
Not even a little. Paglia demands a return to the realities of biology, to Freudian psychology, and to uncompromisingly high intellectual standards.
So it is a wild, incredibly diverse lineup. But if we want to understand how these authors plan to liberate women, we really have to start by looking at how they answer the most fundamental question imaginable.
What is a woman?
Exactly. What even is a woman?
It is the perfect starting point because, as we'll see, the definition is completely contested. The foundation of modern feminist theory arguably begins with a single, very famous sentence from Simone de Beauvoir.
Right. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
That's the one.
I want to pause on that sentence because it's so easily misunderstood, I think. Beauvoir isn't talking about biology there, is she?
No, not exactly.
She's saying that civilization, culture, and upbringing actively construct the feminine reality. It's a social assignment, not like a biological destiny.
Exactly that. Beauvoir approaches this as an existentialist.
Okay, unpack that for me.
So existentialism posits that existence precedes essence, meaning you are born first, just as a blank slate, and you create your essence or your identity through your actions and choices over time.
Right, you make yourself who you are.
Right. But Beauvoir realizes that for women, society forces an essence upon them long before they can choose it for themselves. Yeah. Society tells a little girl from the moment she is born how she must dress, how to act, how to submit. She becomes a woman through 1,000 tiny cultural coercions.
Okay, that makes sense. Society builds the cage. But then Judith Butler takes that idea, grabs it by the collar, and radicalizes it to the extreme.
She takes it to its absolute limit, yeah.
Because Beauvoir says woman is a social category, but Butler goes a massive step further and says the category itself is an illusion.
Exactly. Butler argues that if gender is constructed, there is no internal core essence of gender at all. In Gender Trouble, she writes that gender is a stylized repetition of acts.
A stylized repetition of acts.
Yes, she calls it an anticipation that conjures its own object.
Hang on, break that down for me. What does an anticipation that conjures its own object actually mean in plain English?
Okay, think about it like a performance that has gone on for so long, everyone forgot they were acting. Butler says that because we constantly, daily, repeat these stylized gestures, the way we walk, our clothing choices, the pitch of our voice, we create the illusion that there is a natural biological fact of gender sitting underneath it all.
Oh, I see.
But Butler says there is nothing underneath. The repetition is the gender.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because Butler uses the example of drag queens to illustrate this mechanism.
She does, yes.
And she is very careful to say that drag isn't just like a fun, subversive political model. It is a mechanism that exposes a hidden truth about all of us.
Right.
When a biological male performs in drag as a highly exaggerated woman, Butler says it reveals that all gender is an imitation. There is no original woman that the drag queen is copying. The concept of the original is itself a retroactive fiction created by society to keep us in line.
That is a vital point because it exposes what Butler calls the heterosexual matrix.
The matrix. Here we go.
It sounds sci-fi, but this is basically the cultural system, the grid of power, that demands that bodies, genders, and desires line up in a very specific normative sequence.
So if you're born with a certain anatomy.
Exactly. If you have a certain anatomy, the matrix demands you perform a corresponding gender, and it demands you desire the opposite gender.
And if you don't?
Well, Butler points out that society violently polices those who fail to conform to this matrix. Because if the sequence breaks down, the illusion that gender is natural just completely collapses.
Let me push back on this, just playing devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah, sure.
If Butler says the category of woman is just a performative illusion, this ongoing script we are forced to act out, what does that mean for the actual material suffering of women?
That's the big question.
Right, because if I'm a working class mother working 3 shifts to feed my kids, being told my gender is just a stylized repetition of acts probably sounds incredibly disconnected from my reality.
You're hitting on the exact tension where Audre Lorde and bell hooks enter the conversation.
Yeah.
They look at the word woman and say, wait, you are using a singular noun to flatten a vastly different set of lived experiences. They challenge the very premise that there is a universal woman to begin with.
So Lorde and Hooks argue that you cannot talk about woman as a universal category without erasing the specific, deeply material realities of race and class.
Precisely.
There's a searing critique in Sister Outsider where Lorde goes after the white feminist theologian Mary Daly.
Oh, Lorde's critique of Daly is devastating. It exposes exactly how the category of woman can be weaponized.
How so?
Well, Daly wrote a book detailing the ecology of patriarchal abuse, and she included practices from non-Western cultures like African genital mutilation.
Okay.
But Lorde, as a black lesbian feminist, reads this and realizes Daly is only using the history of non-white women as decorations. Daly is using their trauma purely as evidence of female victimization to bolster a narrative that is fundamentally centered on white women.
So Lorde essentially writes to Daly and says, did you even read my work to see where we connect in our being and becoming? Or did you just hunt through it for evidence of my trauma to legitimize your own theory?
Exactly.
Lorde is furious that the diverse, complex lives of black women were reduced to footnotes of victimhood just to support a white woman's thesis.
And this creates a profound ontological crisis for the feminist movement.
Ontological crisis. Define ontology for us.
Right, sorry. Ontology is just the philosophical study of being what things actually are.
Got it.
So if, as Butler argues, the category of woman is a performative fiction, and if, as Lorde and Hooks argue, the category is fractured by deep, irreconcilable divides of race and class, does the actual subject of feminism just disappear?
It's like trying to build a house when the architects can't even agree on what a brick is.
That's a great way to put it.
And if the very definition of woman is this fiercely contested, it makes perfect sense that the forces keeping her down, like the sources of oppression, are equally debated. Which forces us to ask, if they can't agree on what a woman is, how do they agree on what she is fighting against?
Well, spoiler alert, they don't. To map out that disagreement, we have to look at Christina Hoff Sommers' distinction between two very different camps of feminism.
Okay, let's get into Sommers.
In Who Stole Feminism, Sommers identifies what she calls equity feminism and gender feminism. According to Sommers, the gender feminists, who she argues have completely taken over academia, believe that society is a pervasive, all-encompassing sex-gender system.
Meaning a patriarchy where men, as a collective class, actively and intentionally work to keep women submissive.
Right.
And Sommers flat out rejects that premise.
Completely.
She looks at the academic claim that American women are living under siege in a patriarchal gender war, and she calls it a divisive, exaggerated myth. She literally looks around and says, American women are among the freest creatures on earth.
She does. Sommers views the patriarchy narrative as a mechanism used by academics just to secure funding and maintain a sense of perpetual crisis. But then you have bell hooks, who says the oppression is incredibly real, material, and deadly. However, Hooks critiques mainstream feminism for acting like men are the sole enemy.
Yeah, Hooks is fascinating here because she comes at it from a Marxist perspective.
Right.
For Hooks, the true sources of oppression aren't just bad male attitudes, they are structural. It's white supremacist capitalism and class exploitation.
Yes.
She argues that focusing purely on sexism while ignoring class struggle is a deliberate tactic used by privileged women.
Let's unpack that tactic,
Yes.
because Hooks is unforgiving on this point. She argues that bourgeois women, middle and upper-class white women, actively exploited the notion of male polarization.
How did they exploit it?
Well, they pushed the man as enemy narrative because it drew public and political attention to their own struggles for equal pay and professional advancement.
Oh, interesting.
But by blaming everything on men, they completely deflected attention away from the material starvation, racist exploitation, and class oppression of poor women.
Okay, let's use an analogy here to really ground this for the listener. Imagine American society as a massive sprawling house.
Okay, I like this.
Sommers looks at the house and says, look, it's fundamentally a great house. It was built on the Enlightenment. Maybe we have a few broken windows, some unfair corporate policies, and we need to fix those so women have equal access to every room.
So she wants equity within the existing structure.
Exactly. And how does Hooks view the house?
Oh, Hooks looks at that exact same house and says, the foundation is completely rotten. It was built on the blood of capitalism and racism. Just fixing the windows for the rich women living in the penthouse suite does absolutely nothing for the women suffocating in the basement.
Wow, yeah.
For Hooks, you can't fix the house. You have to tear it down and rebuild society from the ground up.
That is a highly clarifying analogy, if I do say so myself. But just when you think you have mapped out the entire spectrum between Sommers' reform and Hooks' revolution, Camille Paglia kicks the front door in.
She really does.
Paglia listens to Sommers talk about Enlightenment equity, and she listens to Hooks talk about capitalist cultural formations. And Paglia just scoffed at both of them.
Paglia completely changes the terrain. She says we are ignoring the hurricane outside and the tectonic plates underneath the house.
Biology.
Exactly. Paglia roots human dynamics firmly in nature and biology. She argues that modern gender studies has completely ignored a century of anthropology, hard science, and history.
Paglia's critique of the academic obsession with culture is relentless. When academic feminists claim that dark human behaviors like violence or sadomasochism are deeply tied to capitalist cultural formations, Paglia calls it preposterous.
She points out that these theorists act as if the Marquis de Sade never wrote a single page, as if nature itself isn't violently hierarchical and sexually aggressive.
She literally writes that academic feminism relies on French post-structuralist rot, instead of acknowledging the dark biological realities of sex and nature.
She has a way with words.
She really does. She thinks the word gender has just become a prudish code word for social constructionism. Like, it's just a convenient way for academics to avoid talking about actual, messy, biological sex.
Look at the sheer ideological spread we're dealing with here. Sommers sees the problem as a lack of legal and social equity. Hooks sees it as a matrix of capitalism, racism, and sexism. And Paglia sees the problem as a complete failure by intellectuals to acknowledge biological reality.
Which tees us up perfectly for the next massive tension. If these authors fundamentally disagree on what the oppression actually is, who exactly is this feminist movement for? Who is it serving?
This is where we see some truly surprising convergences between authors who are otherwise complete political opposites.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Let's start with Bell Hooks' critique of the movement center. In her book, she explicitly takes aim at a foundational text of second-wave feminism, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique.
Right. Friedan famously wrote about the problem that has no name, which was heralded as the spark that woke up the contemporary feminist movement. She documented the quiet, soul-crushing desperation of the American housewife.
But Hooks reads The Feminine Mystique and points out a massive, glaring blind spot. Hooks notes that Friedan was talking exclusively about college-educated, middle and upper-class white women who were bored with their leisure.
And Hooks argues that Friedan entirely ignored the existence of poor women and women of color who were already working outside the home.
Right.
And they were working in grueling, low-paying, physically demanding jobs. The liberation that Friedan proposed was essentially careerism, getting women out of the domestic sphere and into the professions. But Hooks points out that for working-class women, work isn't liberation, it's exploitation.
We have to linger on a specific anecdote Hooks provides, because it perfectly crystallizes the psychological dissonance of the bourgeois feminist. Hooks quotes a working-class white maid named Helen, who works in the home of a wealthy feminist.
Helen's quote is incredible. She basically says, "My boss wants to be equal to men, but she definitely doesn't want to be equal to me.
Yeah.
She isn't going to liberate us any more than the men are going to liberate their secretaries."
Helen exposes the hypocrisy right at the core of the mainstream movement. The bourgeois feminist boss doesn't want to dismantle the hierarchy of power. She just wants to move up a rung on the ladder.
Exactly.
Her class privilege completely blinds her to the fact that her pursuit of equality relies on the continued exploitation of her own maid. For Hooks, a feminism that serves the boss but not the maid is no feminism at all.
Now, here is where we hit that horseshoe effect I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Christina Hoff Sommers is politically situated in the classical liberal center, miles away from Hooks' Marxist radicalism. Yet, Sommers also fiercely critiques mainstream feminism for alienating everyday women.
But she diagnoses the cause of that alienation entirely differently.
How so?
Sommers argues that modern academic feminism has constructed what she calls a closed system. It's an academic echo chamber that actively tries to convince everyday women that they are victims of a patriarchy. But Sommers points to polling and surveys showing that the vast majority of women do not actually feel like they are under siege.
And how do the academic gender feminists respond when a woman says, "I don't feel oppressed"?
Well,
Sommers says the academics reply, well, that just proves you've been duped by socialization. Your lack of feeling oppressed is proof of how deep the oppression actually goes.
exactly. Sommers describes this as a classic non-falsifiable theory. It operates like a religious dogma. No matter what a woman actually reports about her own lived experience, the academic theory contorts itself to prove she is secretly a victim.
Isn't it fascinating that both Hooks and Sommers are identifying a profound arrogance in the movement?
It's a striking parallel.
They both see a self-appointed leadership class that imposes its own values and its own neuroses onto the masses of women, completely alienating them in the process.
And this widespread alienation stems from fundamentally different definitions of what freedom actually looks like. What are we even striving for? Is it equality, freedom, or the right to be different?
Let's return to Sommers for a second. She is the ultimate champion of equity feminism. She operates on the Enlightenment ideal, which simply asks for a fair field and no favors.
Right.
She wants women to have equal civil rights, equal access to education, and to join men on equal terms in creating a shared human culture.
Sommers is very specific about this shared culture, too. She actively warns against the creation of what she calls a new female ghetto.
A female ghetto.
Yeah, she views separate women's studies departments, or the push for a distinct women's way of knowing, as a dangerous retreat. For Sommers, retreating from the mainstream of intellectual history means surrendering the hard-won victories of equality.
But Bell Hooks looks at that Enlightenment ideal of equality and completely rejects it.
She wants no part of it.
Why? Because for Hooks, wanting social equality with men in the current system is a trap. She asks a very blunt question. Why on earth could women want to be equal participants in a system that is fundamentally corrupt, white supremacist, and capitalist? Integrating into a burning house doesn't save you from the fire.
Hooks isn't looking for reform or a fair field. She is demanding a total restructuring of society. And Audre Lorde adds a critical, methodological layer to this rejection with one of the most famous concepts in all of feminist theory.
Oh, I know this one. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
That's the one.
Stop there, because that phrase is used on protest signs all the time, but we need to explain the mechanism behind it. Why can't I just use the master's hammer to smash the master's house?
Because Lorde isn't talking about physical hammers. She's talking about methods of operating. The master's tools are the conceptual frameworks of patriarchy: hierarchy, exclusion, tokenism, racism, division. Lorde delivered this exact critique at an NYU Humanities conference. She looked around and realized that a panel specifically on difference was virtually the only place Black women or lesbians were represented at the entire conference.
So the conference organizers were trying to address feminism, but they were using the patriarchal tool of tokenism to do it. They were marginalizing certain women while claiming to liberate them.
Exactly. Lorde argues that if you use the master's tools, if you use exclusion, tokenism, and hierarchy to try and build a new society, you haven't achieved genuine liberation. You've just built another master's house with a different set of managers.
That is so powerful.
You cannot achieve freedom by ignoring differences in age, race, class, and sexuality.
She insists that difference shouldn't be flattened or tolerated. It should be seen as a fund of necessary polarities that spark transformative action. But how do we express this freedom?
Right. What does it look like?
For Sommers, it's legal equity. For Hooks, it's mass political action. But for someone like Judith Butler, liberation isn't just political, it's deeply, fundamentally structural. It's about subverting the very grammar of how we exist.
This brings us to the complex intersection of gender, performance, and identity. We touched on Butler's idea that gender is a performance, a verb rather than a noun. But we have to address how she implements this idea, because her book, Gender Trouble, is famously dense and difficult to read.
People complain constantly that Butler's writing is impenetrable, but she actually mounts a philosophical defense of her own difficult writing style, doesn't she?
She does. Butler believes that the received grammar we use every single day, the basic rules of subject and predicate in the English language, is not politically neutral.
Wow, okay.
Ordinary grammar forces us to think in terms of stable, singular subjects and binary genders.
So when critics demand that she write in plain, simple, easy-to-understand English what she calls parochial standards of transparency, she argues that doing so would force her to use the very linguistic tools that oppress women.
Precisely. To borrow Lorde's phrasing, standard grammar is the ultimate master's tool for Butler.
That blows my mind.
Butler believes that to change how we think about gender, we have to actively contest, bend, and break the grammar that structures our thoughts. The difficulty of her writing isn't an accident, it is the political action itself.
But then Camille Paglia steps into the ring and essentially says that is absolute anti-intellectual nonsense.
Paglia is relentless on this front. She completely counters the entire post-structuralist wing of academia that Butler represents.
Right.
Paglia believes that ignoring science, anthropology, and classical history in favor of linguistic word games is a profound intellectual failure.
She pulls no punches. She praises Simone de Beauvoir and Freud, demanding rigorous classical intellectual history. She looks at the modern syllabus full of French post-structuralists, writers like Lacan and Cixous, who focused on language and psychoanalysis, and she calls them pie-in-the-sky utopianists.
Paglia argues that by trying to deconstruct language while simultaneously ignoring the stark realities of biology, academic feminism has created an entire generation of students who are force-fed what she calls cant, drivel, and malarkey.
I have to ask, is Butler just playing word games while women suffer in the real world, as Paglia implies? Or is Paglia so obsessed with biology that she can't see how language traps us?
That's a huge divide.
The contrast is staggering. Butler believes escaping normative violence requires twisting language. Paglia believes ignoring science leaves women entirely unprepared for the reality of human behavior. You can't socialize away millions of years of mammalian evolution, according to Paglia.
With such fiercely competing ideologies and such high stakes regarding reality itself, it is no wonder that anger and conflict are massive, recurring themes in these texts.
So how do these theorists view the utility of anger?
Audre Lorde views anger against racism and sexism as a deeply vital, illuminating tool. She delivered a famous keynote specifically on the uses of anger, arguing that it is a clarifying response to oppression.
It shouldn't be hidden.
Right? Women shouldn't be told to calm down. Anger should be harnessed for precision.
Lorde also locates a deep source of power for women in what she calls the erotic. And we need to define this carefully because Lorde doesn't just mean sexuality.
No, it's much broader.
For Lorde, the erotic is a profound, non-rational, deeply felt knowledge. It is a life force, a capacity for joy and deep connection that patriarchy actively tries to suppress by reducing it merely to the pornographic. Tapping into the erotic means refusing to settle for suffering.
But Christina Hoff Sommers looks at the anger manifesting in modern feminism, specifically in the university system, and sees something entirely destructive.
She calls them anger issues, right?
Yes, the anger issues of gender feminist. She believes this hyper-focus on victimhood fosters a culture of constant indignation, resentment, and collective guilt.
To explain the mechanism of this resentment, Sommers points to a specific model used in a university course at Rutgers. Before the class even begins, the students are required to sign a set of ground rules.
Yeah, this is a crazy example.
And the very first rule is that they must acknowledge that oppression, racism, sexism, classism categorically exists and structures everything.
Sommers points to this and says, look, this is not an educational environment, it's an indoctrination camp. By forcing students to accept the premise of pervasive oppression before they are even allowed to ask a single question or look at a single piece of evidence, the course operates as a closed system immune to logic. It's groupthink masquerading as pedagogy.
Camille Paglia shares that absolute disgust for academic groupthink, though her personal style is quite different. Paglia actually relishes intellectual conflict.
Oh, she loves a fight.
She advocates for the fruitful dialogue of dislike, disagreement, and debate. She accuses women's studies departments of becoming a comfy, chummy morass of unchallenged groupthink, where dissenting voices are bullied into silence by the collective anger of the majority.
So we have Lorde channeling anger as a targeted tool for liberation, Sommers warning that collective resentment destroys intellectual inquiry, and Paglia just begging for good old-fashioned brutal intellectual brawl.
And that leads us to the fact that some of the harshest critiques of feminism in these books come directly from within the movement itself.
The level of self-reflection and sometimes self-laceration in these texts is remarkable. Let's look at Paglia's blistering assessment of the academic landscape. She calls contemporary academic feminism third-rate, 10th-rate stuff.
She calls out specific, highly celebrated feminist scholars like Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, saying they write in a garbled, rumbling, hollow, rolling trash can style.
Rolling trash can style. It's brutal.
Paglia argues that this insular academic culture has produced a lost generation of young women who aren't taught to think critically, but just to parrot victimhood ideology.
Sommers echoes this concern about the degradation of intellectual standards. She warns that creating a climate of gender mistrust of received knowledge, where students are taught to dismiss classic literature or scientific discoveries simply because they were produced by men, adds to a rampant, dangerous anti-intellectualism in our broader culture.
And then Bell Hooks, coming from the radical left, offers her own internal critique that is equally devastating. We touched on this earlier, but Hooks argues that the simplistic good girls versus bad boys narrative of sexism is a massive strategic failure.
It's an unconstructive paradigm.
Yeah.
Hooks points out that this dogmatic absolutist ideology labeling all men as the enemy actually forces many women who have deep, caring, familial bonds with men to abandon the feminist movement entirely.
They feel forced to choose.
Exactly. They feel forced to choose between the political movement and the men they love, and they end up walking away from the movement.
What stands out to you about these critiques? Because to me, it's the sheer consensus of the critique among three authors who share absolutely no political ground.
That's the wild part.
Despite their wildly different worldviews, Hooks, Paglia, and Sommers all independently identify a profound dogmatism within mainstream feminism. They all see a movement that risks becoming closed, insular, and hostile to dissenting thought.
It is a vital observation. So after spending so much time tearing down the existing structures or watching these authors tear them down, we have to ask, what do they actually want to build? After all the critiques, what do they believe feminism should be right now?
For Bell Hooks, the goal is a mass-based liberatory movement that can be shared with everyone. She heavily references the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, arguing that true liberation must be built on profound dialogue and love.
Love and dialogue.
It requires acknowledging our complicity in oppressive systems, but doing so with compassion. And crucially, it requires seeing men not as enemies, but as necessary comrades in the struggle to unlearn sexism.
Meanwhile, Christina Hoff Sommers wants a return to classic Enlightenment equity. She wants women to read the great books of humanity, to join men on equal terms in the sciences, the arts, and politics. She entirely rejects the idea of creating a separate female epistemology, viewing that as a self-imposed ghetto that separates women from the mainstream of human achievement.
And Camille Paglia. Her prescription for the future of feminism is heavily rooted in academic and intellectual reform. She demands that hard science and biology be made fundamental components of all gender studies.
Right.
She insists that programs be assessed for ideological bias, and she genuinely promotes true diversity of thought, regardless of the political leaning.
Paglia goes so far as to praise young women in campus abstinence clubs.
Really?
Yeah. She notes that as a pro-sex, pro-pornography feminist herself, she profoundly respects those chaste young women because they are defying campus groupthink and fiercely defending their individuality. For Paglia, true feminism is intellectual independence, whatever form that takes.
So, as a listener, you are presented with three radically different visions for the future. A revolutionized society built on love and mass political action. A unified human culture built on classical equity. Or a rigorously scientific, fiercely debated intellectual arena. Which feels most urgent to you?
To really highlight how deep these divides go, and to ensure we aren't smoothing over the rough edges, we need to put these colliding worldviews directly head-to-head. Let's look at the irreconcilable contradictions. Where do these books fundamentally clash?
The first major clash is what we can call the patriarchy debate. Are we currently living in a patriarchy?
According to Christina Hoff Sommers, the pervasive sex-gender system is largely a myth in modern America. She argues it is a narrative maintained by academics to secure funding and instill victimhood in young women.
But according to Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde,
Right. For them, patriarchy, inextricably interwoven with white supremacy and capitalism, is a deadly material reality that literally kills women. There is no middle ground there.
Then there is the biology debate. Camille Paglia is screaming from the rooftops that we must acknowledge biology, nature, and Darwinian realities. She believes ignoring the physical reality of hormones and evolution is intellectual suicide.
But Judith Butler deconstructs nature entirely. For Butler, the idea that there is a natural biological sex that predates social construction is a retroactively applied fiction. Biology isn't destiny, it's just another discourse of power used to control us.
And finally, we have the master's tools debate. Sommers desperately wants women to read the great books of humanity, the established, historically male-dominated canon, so that women can claim their rightful place in that intellectual lineage.
But Audre Lorde, And many of the academic transformationists Sommers critiques argue that those tools are fundamentally compromised by male and white supremacy. You cannot use the canon of the oppressor to write the language of your own liberation.
We must remind you, the listener, that our goal today is not to declare that Sommers is right and Lorde is wrong, or that Paglia wins and Butler loses. The entire point of this deep dive is to show that feminist theory is not a monolith.
It is a live, fiercely contested, brilliant, and sometimes brutal intellectual battlefield. To flatten these profound disagreements into a single party line does a massive disservice to the intellect of these authors.
We have traced an incredible arc today. We move from the existential awakening of Simone de Beauvoir's Other, a realization that womanhood is a socially constructed cage. We navigated the intersectional, mass-based demands of bell hooks and Audre Lorde, who insisted that we cannot ignore the material realities of race and class.
We wrestled with the performative, grammatical subversions of Judith Butler, who challenged the very reality of gender itself.
And we crashed headlong into the fierce, anti-dogmatic academic critiques of Christina Hoff Sommers and Camille Paglia, who demanded rigorous intellectual standards and a return to biological reality.
There is no single winner. Feminism, as seen through these 6 lenses, is an ongoing, high-stakes negotiation of power, identity, biology, and freedom. And as we close, this raises an important question, a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If, as Judith Butler and bell hooks suggest, our language, our institutions, and our society are so deeply encoded with oppressive gender norms, but our physical reality is as undeniably rooted in biology and nature as Camille Paglia insists, is the ultimate goal of feminism to transcend our gender entirely, or to finally be allowed to fully inhabit it without penalty?
That is the ultimate paradox. We started this deep dive by looking at an architectural blueprint that was completely on fire, trying to figure out what a woman is and what she needs liberating from. We didn't find a single unified answer, but we found a spectrum of brilliant, challenging lenses that force us to think harder about the world we live in. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus, keep reading these incredible sources, and we'll see you next time.
Today's manuscript is a sweeping synthesis of feminist theory that attempts to reconcile classical equity paradigms with radical social constructionism and intersectional critique. And diving right into the feedback, the first major issue is that the manuscript attempts to harmonize fundamentally incompatible feminist epistemologies, which inadvertently flattens the vital combative tension that really drives the discourse forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the weakness here is that the text currently presents the evolution of feminism as this single linear progression, just smoothing over the aggressive epistemological clash between classical equity feminism and gender or radical feminism.
Right. By trying to blend these perspectives into a unified theory, the manuscript creates this false consensus that just diminishes the radical stakes of the original arguments.
Exactly. So the suggestion for the writer is to restructure the central argument to highlight this ideological fault line rather than burying it.
Use the specific contradictions in the text to fuel the narrative, right? Demonstrate those irreconcilable differences at the heart of the movement.
Right. We definitely need to give some concrete examples for improvement here. For instance, the author should contrast Christina Hoff Sommers' defense of Enlightenment ideals directly against bell hook's argument that liberal individualism actually consolidates class society.
Well, and, to play devil's advocate for the manuscript a little bit, Sommers has a really practical point in Who's Stole Feminism. I mean, her fair field and no favors approach is tangible. If you have equal access to institutions, isn't that the baseline of liberation?
But see, that's exactly what Hooks is dismantling in feminist theory, from margin to center. I mean, you can't have a fair field when the field itself requires a permanent underclass.
Right.
Hooks argues that competitive, atomistic, liberal individualism isn't liberation. It's just bourgeois white women trying to get the same class privileges as white men. They're essentially co-opting the movement.
But if you just completely throw out those institutional Enlightenment ideals, you kind of lose the legal framework that secures basic civil rights. I mean, I get the critique of dogma, but Sommers isn't necessarily wrong to defend the necessity of institutional equity.
And that right there, that exact tension, that is what the manuscript is missing. The author needs to show this fight on the page, instead of pretending Sommers and Hooks are just building different floors of the same house.
Yeah, they're actively trying to burn each other's houses down.
Exactly. And you see this exact same false consensus later in the manuscript regarding the body, which brings us to the next point.
It does. The analysis of the female body currently oscillates between a rigid biological anchor and a pure cultural abstraction without sufficiently exploring the messy, lived intersection of both.
Yeah, building on those ideological fractures we just covered, the weakness in this section is that the draft separates the philosophical concept of woman as other from the physical realities of the body.
Right. It treats the body either as an immutable fact or just a total blank slate.
Right, which completely misses the opportunity to explore how these authors define the physical form as an active site of political negotiation.
So the suggestion here is to integrate the phenomenological experience of the body deeply into the political theories, demonstrating how the physical form itself is contested territory across these different feminist schools of thought.
Yes, and for concrete examples for improvement, the author needs to bring Simone de Beauvoir's concept of the body as a situation into direct conversation with Judith Butler's performativity.
Because for Beauvoir in The Second Sex, the body is this lived reality, right? It's defined by its resistance and its heavy weight. And then you have Butler in Gender Trouble saying the very categories of male and female are just political tools used to enforce a heterosexual matrix.
Exactly. Gender is just a repeated stylization of the body for Butler.
But, I have to ask, if the author leans too far into Butler's discursive construction of the body, is there a risk of alienating the reader who experiences the body in the visceral, unyielding way Beauvoir describes? I mean, biology isn't just a performance.
Well, that's a very fair point. And that's why the text needs to contrast this heavily discursive view with Camille Paglia's stance in Free Women, Free Men. Paglia insists that sexuality is the intricate intersection of nature and culture.
Right. She furiously pushes back against social constructionism. She absolutely refuses to deny a hormonal basis to sex differences. She looks at academic feminism and basically says it has completely lost touch with the nature.
Exactly. And then, to really complicate things, the author should introduce Monique Witting's radical claim that a lesbian is not a woman because she steps outside the heterosexual bodily economy entirely.
Wait, so Wittig is essentially saying womanhood is just a job description in a patriarchal economy?
Yes, it's a structural class. If you refuse the reproductive and domestic labor mandated by heterosexuality, you vacate the class. You step out of the economy.
Oh, wow. But see, if I'm reading the manuscript and I have Paglia screaming about undeniable biological realities and Butler arguing the body is a script and Wittig saying womanhood is an economic class, how does the author reconcile that?
They don't. I mean, that's the beauty of it. The author shouldn't try to synthesize them, let the tensions sit there unresolved. It makes for a much more intellectually honest critique.
Yeah, you don't need a neat winner.
No, you really don't. You just need to show the collision.
Which leads perfectly into the final major issue. The compartmentalization of race, class, and sexual identity into a single standalone section severely undermines the foundational argument that oppression is intrinsically interconnected.
Yeah. The weakness here is that, flowing naturally from the discussion of which bodies matter, the manuscript treats intersectionality as a localized, isolated topic rather than a pervasive lens.
Right. By cordoning off the experiences of marginalized women, the text inadvertently replicates the exact academic erasure that thinkers like Audre Lorde and bell hooks passionately argue against.
Exactly. So the suggestion is to thread the critique of exclusionary practices and the intersection of race, class, and sexuality throughout every chapter to continuously challenge the notion of a universal feminist subject.
But, I have to ask, if weaving these perspectives throughout every chapter like a new colored thread fundamentally alters the pattern of the tapestry, might it disrupt the chronological progression of the manuscript? How can the writer maintain narrative momentum while doing so?
Well, the chronological progression just isn't as important as the intellectual collision. Think about Beauvoir's push for transcendence, right? Achieving full human freedom.
Yeah, moving from immanence to transcendence.
Right. But if the author weaves hooks in right there, they have to ask who gets to transcend. Because historically, bourgeois white women only achieve that transcendence by offloading their domestic physical labor onto working-class women and women of color.
That's a great point. the so-called universal liberation actually depended on someone else's continued oppression.
Exactly. So applying Lorde and Hooks as an active lens throughout the entire manuscript destroys the illusion that there was ever a single, unified group in feminist theory.
It forces the reader to confront those blind spots immediately, rather than waiting for a specific chapter on race at the end of the book.
Right, it respects the complexity of the movement.
All right, to recap, this critique centers on embracing the inherent frictions within feminist theory to strengthen the manuscript.
Right, the key actionable suggestions are to frame the work around the ideological clash between equity and radical feminism rather than forcing a false consensus.
To ground the abstract political theories in the contested physical reality of the body.
And to weave intersectional critiques of race and class throughout the entire text rather than isolating them.
The material has immense potential, and the listener is highly encouraged to revise these structural elements and submit the work back in for further review.